the book of Acts, chapter 18. And I'm hoping we're going to finish up the chapter 18. We might not, but we're going to do our very best. And it may be that we end up leaking into another sermon because the whole idea starts to change once we get to verse 18 of chapter 18. When we get to 18:18, the whole shift of the idea changes. And so we want to get up to 17 at least tonight. And then if we can, maybe wait on 18:18 until Sunday morning because it begins a whole new thought. But what we were looking at this morning was that God encourages His servants. God blesses His servants in four ways. At least we see, this isn't the only ways that He does it, but in the life of Paul, we see four ways that He encouraged Paul as he was at Corinth. And we already said this morning that in Corinth it was very difficult for him. And God blessed him with friends. We saw that this morning, that He blessed him with new friends in Priscilla and Aquila, and with old friends when Silas and Timothy came back from Macedonia and came back down to Corinth and brought a little bit of money with them. That's always a little bit of an encouragement as well, but we didn't throw that into our list. So friends, he was encouraged with friends. He was encouraged with ministry. As soon as he met up with Timothy and Silas, he then put all of his heart into ministry, and he began studying and preaching the Word of God daily. He kind of laid down the tent making for a while because he had enough funds to be able to do that. And so he began preaching, and he went to the Jewish people first, like he always did, into the synagogue. They refused to accept the truth of Jesus Christ. So he shook out his cloak. He said, "I'm done with y'all. I'm tired of this." And then he leaves, and he goes right next door to a house of Gaius Titius Justus. And while he was there, he led that man to the Lord. And we hear about him later on. We hear about him in 1 Corinthians and in Romans. And so he was able to lead someone to the Lord. That, like I said this morning, that is an amazing encouragement. If you're ever down in the dumps and you get to share the gospel with somebody, that takes you right up out of that, right up onto the mountaintop one more time. And so he got to share the gospel, and somebody believed. And Gaius Titius Justus was a Roman leader of some sort, and so he was high up in the ranks in Corinth. Then, if that wasn't enough, he also was able to lead Crispus. And this is in verse 18, verse 8, he was able to lead Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, to the Lord and his whole household. And because of that, many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and were being baptized. And so there we see the ministry that God gives the servant when they're down and out. And so with friends, with ministry, He blesses, but also He blesses with Himself. And we looked at that this morning as well, beginning in verse 9. It says, "And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, 'Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you.'" Now, I don't know about you, but do you really need any more encouragement than that? I mean, with that alone, you don't need the friends. You don't need the ministry. When God says, "I'm with you," that should be enough. And so He says to Paul at night in a vision, "Listen, don't worry, don't be afraid. There's stuff going on in this town. I know how bad it looks. I know the sin that's everywhere, but please go on speaking. Do not be silent. I am with you. No man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." We spent some time on that this morning. And then we finished up with verse 11. "And he settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them." So we've gotten through 3 of the way that He blesses His servants, with friends, with ministry, with Himself. And now we're going to finish up with the last way that He blesses His servants. That is with justice. With justice. So let's pick up at verse 12. "But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat." Now, I got to explain this verse a little bit, so we've got some historical context. What you have here is a leader in the city, a Roman judge. And this Roman judge is who you would take all of your problems to. So if the Jews, even though they weren't Roman citizens, they were allowed to practice Judaism. But that was the only religion that they were allowed to practice outside of Roman religion. So they allowed, because it was so dominant in that day, the Jewish people, they allowed them to practice Judaism in the town of Corinth, in their synagogues. And then, of course, if they wanted to, they were allowed to pilgrimage all the way to Jerusalem, give sacrifices, things of that nature. But it was allowed. Judaism was allowed in Corinth. And this guy, Gallio, was the leader of the Roman judge leader in this town of Corinth. And not just Corinth, but the entire, you could call it maybe a county of Achaia. If you go back to the map, show them the map, Joey, in the zoomed in version. You see in really big letters up there, it says Achaia, Achaia or Achaia, right above Corinth. That's an area. That's a large area of about 400 square miles right there. And this guy was the judge over all of that. And Corinth was the county seat. It's where the city hall would be, okay? And so the people, the Jewish people, wanted to get rid of Paul. So the legal way, they thought the legal way for us to do this is, let's take Paul and drag him before Gallio, and Gallio will show him that he is guilty and force him out of Achaia, and he won't have to preach here anymore. We'll get rid of him, the legal way. So that's what's going on in verse 12. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before, and then there's that word, judgment seat. Now, in front of the house of the proconsul, in front of Gallio's house, would have been a large stone area, and there would have been something in the middle called the agora, kind of like a table, a place where he could stand and make ruling and judgment. And so they grabbed Paul. We don't know how, whether he was chained or maybe just manhandled or maybe he went of his own accord. But somehow they grabbed him and they brought him up to this agora. They brought him to this table that's in front of the proconsul's home. And then they lay out the charges put against him. So now that you've got it in your mind what it looks like, let's jump into verse 13. Saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. That's their whole charge against him. He is persuading men to worship God, and they acknowledge that it's the same God they worship. They didn't say another God, a different God. He is persuading men to worship our God, Yahweh God, but he's doing so in a way that's contrary to our law. Now, I don't know exactly how this charge fits into what Paul was preaching. Because he probably was preaching Jesus. He probably was preaching the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. He probably was teaching that through faith in Jesus alone, you have access to God. And that didn't line up with their law of Messiah. The Jewish people thought that their Messiah had not come yet. Paul comes in saying, no, Messiah has come. And so they might say, this is probably where their thought comes from. I can't say for sure because I wasn't there. But they could be saying, listen, what you're saying goes against our law because our law says Messiah is coming. And you're preaching he's already come. That is against the law because he isn't here. And so he's saying, he's proclaiming to worship God in a different way, a way that's contrary to our law. That's the charge they bring against him. Verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth. I love that. Paul didn't even have to say anything. He didn't even mutter a word. God had already promised him a few verses before, no one will harm you. No harm will come to you because I have people in the city. He begins to open his mouth. Verse 14, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. In other words, if he did something wrong, I want to know about it. I'll be able to do something about it. If he broke a law, a Roman law, if he did something that was obvious, we can talk about that. Verse 15. But if there are questions about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. In other words, you guys are fighting over spiritual semantics. It has to do with your book. It has to do with your law. This has nothing to do with Roman law or Roman spirituality. In other words, You handle it yourselves. You guys go sit down and have a grown-up conversation like a couple of big boys and talk it out. Find out where the problem is, because this is not a legal matter. And so Goliath wants to just wash his hands of this. He's probably frustrated that he's even been dragged into this. You ever been dragged in to a situation by children? A little petty argument, right? They took mine. He said that, right? That's exactly what's going on. And there's a lot of discussion about Goliath. We actually know a lot about him. Goliath is the brother to Seneca. And Seneca was a major historian and leader during the time of Nero. And so we know about Goliath. He was a very good man. He was a kind man. Very, very smart. All of this is in history that's outside of the Bible. So without the Bible, we can know a lot about Goliath. And explain what kind of guy he was. He was fair. And so I could imagine him being a mature, intelligent leader in this Roman area. And so when this comes to him, he's, in my mind, I'm thinking he's saying, okay, you guys are a bunch of kids. Grow up and go handle it yourself. This is beyond, you got no business coming to me, okay? If he hits one of y'all in the face or, kills one of your animals, let's talk about that. But come on, this just seems like you're arguing over spiritual issues. Go back to the synagogue and talk about it. And so he just, he's kind of like shooing off children who are fighting in his presence. He says at the end of verse 15, I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. And he drove them away from the judgment seat. Now, of course, he would have had soldiers at his disposal. And so he probably like, okay, I don't want anything to do with this. And they said, but Goliath, but judge. And he just, okay, guys, get him out of here. And then the soldiers come with their spears and swords and they, make them leave from the front of his house. Get him out of there. But Jewish people at this time were hard to appease. And they were allowed to do certain things, apparently. And it wasn't looked at unfavorably. So when you look at verse 17, it says, and they all, we're to assume that they all are the Jewish people who drugged Paul, rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes. Now, Sosthenes becomes a believer. We don't know if he's a believer at this moment or not, but we know he definitely becomes one, because when you get into the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 1 and verse 1, if you've been with us on Wednesday, then you know about this. It says, this is 1 Corinthians 1:1, Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. And so Paul and Sosthenes are writing the book of 1 Corinthians back to Corinth. And so he obviously becomes a believer at some point, if he's not one already, in this chapter 18, verse 17 of the book of Acts. But we know he becomes one. And he may even become an amanuensis. Somebody remember what an amanuensis is? The secretary, okay? So he could have been, for the book of 1 Corinthians, the secretary for Paul. Sometimes it's easier, if you're in a frame of thought and you're thinking about what you want to write, to just say it and let someone else write it down. And it could have been that's what Sosthenes was to Paul. That when he was writing the book of 1 Corinthians, he kind of signed his name in there because he was the one writing down Paul's words. Either way, Sosthenes became a believer or is a believer at this point. So let's look at what happens to him in verse 17. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. So we have two. Remember this morning we talked about a leader in the synagogue, Crispus. So we've got Crispus and Sosthenes, who were both leaders in the synagogue. But in this verse, they only grabbed a hold of Sosthenes. Maybe Crispus knew better and he stayed home. Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. So they try to drive him out. Maybe they drove him out and they turn around and come back. All of a sudden they start beating Sosthenes in his front yard. But Goliath was not concerned about any of these things. Now, what it seems to me is that the Jewish people, they were going to have a whipping boy. Someone was going to pay for this truth that was being taught. It could have been that they beat Sosthenes because Sosthenes knew what Paul wanted to preach and he let him into the synagogue anyway. and he let him preach the truth of Jesus Christ, and so they beat him for it. Someone was going to pay for what Paul was doing, and Gallio said, I'm not putting Paul in front of you to beat. Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul could not just be beaten willy-nilly by whoever wanted to beat him. He had the authority of Rome behind him. That's why they couldn't beat Paul. But Sosthenes was a Jew. And he was able to be beaten by the Jewish people without any recompense. And so they needed a whipping boy, so they beat on Sosthenes. It could be that he was Jewish and he hadn't received Christ as his Savior, but he let Paul in, and so they're going to beat him for that. It could be that he believed, and they wanted somebody to be punished for believing in the message of Paul. And so as a spectacle, as a way to demonstrate this is what happens to people who say they believe in this Jesus that Paul is preaching, we're going to beat Sosthenes publicly and let everyone know who's part of our Jewish community, you cannot believe in Jesus or this will happen to you. Like I said, I don't know which one it is. Maybe one that's completely outside of both of those. However, it's interesting to me that from what we get in the text, no one intervened. Paul didn't jump in and stop them from beating Sosthenes from what we read. None of the other Christians that were saved. If you remember, Gaius was saved. He was also part of the Roman government. Crispus, who was the other synagogue leader, was saved just a few verses ago. Where was he at, and why wasn't he protecting Sosthenes? There's a lot of open questions here that we don't really have the answers to. Bottom line is, in this situation, Paul was promised by God, no one will lay a hand on you. And no one laid a hand on Paul. God never breaks his promises. And whenever he is looking to protect and take care of and bless his servants, at least in this text, we see that he does so in 4 ways. With friends, with ministry. I'm forgetting one, Joey. Throw my 4 back up. With friends, with ministry, with himself, and with justice. Now go to that last slide that I have up there about justice. It's at the end. Now listen to this carefully. Sometimes you get to witness justice for sins committed against you. Most often you don't. Sometimes you get to witness justice for sins committed against you. Sometimes when someone does something against you, whether it's legally wrong, spiritually wrong, or if it's just an emotional pain, sometimes you get to witness when God gets them. Most often you don't. But the key thing to remember is we are never to be about wanting that or waiting for that. If someone hurts us, we go on about our business. We go on about worshiping God. Sometimes God allows us a glimpse into what happens. Sometimes whenever someone commits a horrific crime, murder, rape, sometimes justice is done. Sometimes we get to see that justice. Sometimes it gets to come to an end for us and we feel a little bit of relief. Sometimes we don't. Paul, in this instance, he was brought before Gaius or Gallio, and Gallio could have went above and beyond his Roman ability and sentenced him to be beaten or whatever, but he didn't because God already said, I'm going to protect you, Paul. And Paul was able to see that those Jewish people didn't get what they wanted, at least out of him. And we don't know how he felt about Sosthenes. But sometimes you get to witness whenever justice happens for sins committed against you. But most often you won't. So don't get caught up in it. When someone hurts you, don't say, God, why won't you get them and how come I can't see it? I want you to hurt them bad and I want to see it. I want you to get back at them. Remember, God said, vengeance is mine. Not only is it his, but it's in his time, not ours. So we must be careful not to be completely enveloped in all of that. Paul could have, asked God, I want you to kill them. I want you to hurt them. I want you to do something to them. And maybe sometimes it's not a bad thing to air out your heart and just give it all up to God and say, I don't know if you've ever read the Psalms, but David did that a lot. David was like, God, would you kill my enemies? Would you slaughter them? Would you beat them to death? Would you drown them in a... he just all the time was praying against his enemies. All the time. Maybe there's a place for that. I don't know. All I know is I have a heart that is tempted to become hard And I don't want my heart hardened. And so I'm always trying to pray for people, not pray for bad things to happen to people. And I don't see Paul doing that. The only time he ever gets mad or angry or whenever something really detrimental is happening in his life or in the life of the church, he usually says things like, give them over to Satan. Kick them out of the church and pray that they'll come back. Because whenever there's that kind of sin in the church, something has to be done. And by the way, a lot of that happens in Corinth, right where he's at. A lot of the horrible sins that took place inside the church happened in this city. And if you want to dive deeper into that, I suggest you start coming on Wednesdays, because we're about to hit some of the major sins that Paul had to deal with and how he dealt with them. And they become a prescription for us of how we are to deal with sins in the church. And it's important for us to learn and to know how to do that. Well, let's dismiss. And once again, I pray the Lord has blessed you. And we're going to pick up with verse 18. And what we're going to find in chapter 18, verse 18, and going all the way through chapter 19 and verse 7, is we're going to find that there are three sets of people that are behind the times. You ever felt like you were behind the times? You ever felt like the world was moving faster and you couldn't keep up? Technology and computers and things are moving forward and I can't keep up with it all. We're going to look at that Sunday morning, and it's going to be very, very interesting. So let's dismiss. And I'm going to ask Chris, if you would, to dismiss us tonight. If there's anyone who wants to make a decision, you can talk to me after the service. And, either about getting saved, getting baptized, joining the church, or any other decision that you may have. And you can always talk to me after the service. So whenever you're ready, brother.